Rosie returned to the ranch 2 years later after starting formal divorce proceedings against her husband. Helena comforted her, and, of course, so did Joe. Comfort turned into dining. Dining turned into dancing. And in the end, Joe and Rosie were shacked up for days at a time in an old cabin in a remote part of the canyons. "I've got kids, you know," Rosie murmured one morning. Joe still held her in his arms. "Yeah, so? They'll stay in Texas with Devon, won't they?" Joe sleepily replied. "Well, they're a part of me. We ended up together, permanent-like. I'll have at least 2 younger girls with me," she spat out. Joel rolled over from her. He stated coldly to the wall, "There is nothing permanent going on here." Joe and Rosie were formally married the next year after much secret habitation. The Drokes had long since retired and sold their small homestead to the Grodens, a more successful ranch family. Joe and Rosie moved into the Drokes' place shack of a house. Their friends did the local wedding tradition of trashing everything. They tipped over the outhouse, broke out windows, toilet papered the shack of a house, and broke beer and liquor bottles all over the place. Rosie wept through most of the night. Joe, in typical autistic defense mode, withdrew with Rosie in their bedroom, blocked the doorway with a dresser to keep the violent revelers at bay. He had nothing to say as he tried to soothe Rosie, who was not at all acclimated to the local yokels' craziness. Chapter 7. Changing of the Guard. Zino was already an old man when Joe had first met him in the 1930s. With his dark, deeply lined, craggy face and deep-set eyes, to Joe it seemed like the old Mexican was 100 years old. That is why he always thought of him as Old Zino. Now, some 20 years later, in the 1950s, Zino was actually in his late 70s. He had lived a very hard life, over half of it as a needlessly deprived and lonely fugitive. He had carved out a hardscrabble existence in the forgotten canyons of the high plains, with little comfort and few friends. Time, trouble, and weather all took their toll. He felt his life starting to slip away. It seemed less real to him with every passing day. He sat on a large flat rimrock boulder that had fallen in ancient times from the canyon's edge, far above him. He held a children's grade school writing tablet against the flat rock surface and wrote slowly and carefully with a pencil he had sharpened with his hunting knife. Slowly, Zeno's last will and testament became scrawled down the page. He wrote the few words he knew how to write in Spanish, a couple of sentences, listing the names of nearly forgotten relatives, and a short list of possessions that they should have, along with his sheep-herding canyon homestead. Zeno carefully tore out and folded the coarse brown tablet paper and set 3 native flint arrowheads he had found on top of his will, in the middle of his one small table. 2 nights later, he died in his sleep without a sound, nor anyone to hear it. If he had any last words. Joe found his body a few days after that. Joe woodenly went through the motions of burying the old man that had become as close to being a father to him as anyone. He began to envision a whiskey bottle in his hands. His grief gripped him completely and unexpectedly. He told himself not to feel bad with self-talk, shouting through tears. "He was just an old Mexican. Why should you care? He had a hard life, but you helped him whenever you could. Everyone dies. I'll probably be joining him real soon." Old Zeno used to say, "You hit me with the freeze cat, now I kill you," Joe announced into the wind. He wanted to drink, more than anything else. Just get alone and drink. But he felt obliged to his old friend. Somebody's got to do something with his sheep. I know he didn't have many left, but there must be a few. I guess I better go see what needs doing in the morning. Nobody else will do a GD thing for an old Mexican. He spoke to the air. The thought of becoming responsible for his old friend's flock kept him from giving in to the desire to leave the canyon, to seek drink. Chapter 8. Raising 2 Boys. "Rosie, I am ordering you to pay attention here and now," Joe loudly declared to Rosie, sitting across from him at the Droke place's small, bare kitchen table. "Okay, Joe, what the ever?" Rosie said slowly as she raised her head and squinted at Joe. "I mean it, Rosie. There'll be no offspring. I want no children. Is that clear?" he inquired as he glared at her. Rosie tilted her head slightly, bird-like, and said quietly, "No children? Well, that's fine. I've already had 4. That's enough." Ah, but there came 2 babies, both boys. They all lived at the Droke place. Well, one was mostly at least 30% boy and maybe 70% girl. Steve was born in the summer of 1960. Steve's little brother Clyde was born in 1961. Clyde barely lived, this RH baby. His body was covered in flaky red and tan scabs that ran in lines, generally following his underlying nervous system. He was allergic to just about everything, and in spite of all his challenges, he was a sunny-faced, happy little guy. "Watch out, your mama will have you out chasing jackrabbits," Joe taught his boys. Steve watched his daddy milk the cow. He had been walking out to the barn every night for several nights to watch his father milk the cow. He heard his mother faintly, calling his little brother's name in the distance. "Clyde, where are you, you little Dickens?" Rosie called over and over again. His father squeezed the cow's teats 2 at a time, 1 in each hand. The white enameled bucket sat in the dirt under the cow's udder half filled. Rosie rushed up and shouted at Joe, "I can't find him! I can't find Clyde! Come help me find him right now! Please, Joe, help me find him!" Joe stopped milking and turned to his wife. "Have you checked the front yard, the shop, the cattle guard on the road?" "I've searched everywhere he could be. It's like he's up and disappeared," Rosie exclaimed, worried. Steve piped up, "I seen Clyde." Rosie turned to him and demanded, "Where? Where did you see your little brother?" "Playing boats in the tank. Playing boats," 3-year-old Steve answered simply. Rosie turned and ran toward the large cow watering tank between the barn and the house. She stopped suddenly and pointed towards the middle of the tank. She started screaming, "Joe! Joe! There he is! He's on the bottom!" Joe handed the half-full bucket of milk to Steve and told him, "Hold on to this milk, Steve. Don't drop it. Don't you let it get in the dirt. I've got to go see what your mother is hollering about." 3-year-old Steve used all his strength to hold up the bucket. It was half as big as he was. Joe ran to where Rosie was pointing. He stopped short and sputtered. Then he ran and jumped into the water tank and waded to the center. He stooped down into the water and picked something up. Steve saw his little brother come up out of the water in his father's arms. Clyde was not moving. He had a strange blue color. "Oh, he's not breathing! Oh my God, my baby is dead! Clyde is dead! He's not breathing!" screamed Rosie as Joe stepped out of the cow tank and stood looking down at his still son laying dripping in his arms. Joe stood frozen, not moving, not breathing. The bucket of milk grew heavier in Steve's hands. He pulled up with all his strength, trying to follow his father's directive to keep the bucket out of the dirt. "I was washing the clothes. I just looked away for a minute. What are we going to do, Joe? He's not moving. He's dead. My baby is dead!" Rosie screamed as both parents stood frozen in place. Joe started running towards the house. Rosie chased after him, screaming inarticulate sounds. Steve stood still, watching with eyes wide, unsure of what had just happened. His parents disappeared with his listless blue brother into the back door of their little house. Steve stood alone, staring at the closed back door, straining to hold up the bucket of milk. Finally, he carefully lowered the heavy bucket of milk to the ground. He felt scared to be punished for letting the bucket down. His concern for his little brother overcame his concern for the bucket. Steve left the bucket and raced for the back door. He opened the door and saw his father, shaking a nude Clyde violently, his thumbs pressed firmly into his brother's chest. His mother was collapsed on her knees on the floor, reaching her hands up toward her unmoving son in Joe's hands. She continued crying uncontrollably. Clyde came back alive and woke up while Steve was watching. He puked all over his father's shirt and began to cry. Joe smiled from ear to ear. Rosie jumped to her feet and ran to her son. She laughed and cried hard as she took Clyde into her arms and kissed him. "Clyde! Clyde! Dear Clyde, you're okay! You're alive! You're alive!" she yelled. Steve heaved a little sigh of relief and ran up to his father. "Daddy, Daddy, I'm sorry. I held it up best I could. I put the milk down. I dropped the milk. I'm sorry, Daddy." "Oh, Steve, don't worry about it. That doesn't matter. It don't matter at all. Your brother is alive. He's alive, Steve. That's all that matters." One of Rosie's full-grown turkeys ran up to 4-year-old Steve and knocked him down. Rosie grabbed that one and hauled it over to a large wood splitting log as Steve picked himself up off the ground, sputtering and crying. While Steve watched, Rosie held the turkey down on the flat log round with her left hand and chopped its head off with a hatchet in her right hand. She released the body to the ground, and Steve shrieked and ran away as the headless body stood up and ran around crazily for a few seconds, sometimes chasing right after him. Rosie made a little extra money selling her turkeys. The family also ate a lot of turkey. Steve had always been adventurous. When he was about 3 years old, he was spotted through a deer hunter's spotting scope from across the canyon. The hunter was keenly interested. He was a local weekly newspaper journalist who published the following account in the newspaper in 1963. A little boy ran along a dusty cattle trail, weaving between juniper trees and chattering happily. He seemed taken with the pungent scent given off by the stunted, gnarled evergreens. He happily swooped up and down, sniffing the air. He was chattering non-stop, although I was too far away to hear anything the toddler said. I saw him scramble past the trees and run right up to the edge of the cliff on the other side of the rimrock I stood upon. The toddler stopped short and stared with wide, wondering eyes into the narrow canyon that yawned below him. This canyon has giant walls of deep red and orange sandstone chiseled into the chasm. Bending over his awkward diaper, the boy dropped to his hands and knees, crawled to the edge, and looked down. He wiggled his fingers over the edge and looked down at the massive rectangular blocks of stone that littered the bottom of the canyon hundreds of feet below. How small the trees were down there. He slid some pebbles over the edge and smiled as they bounced off the flat walls and sped away out of sight. The boy heard a sound and looked up over his shoulder. It was the high-pitched, long-distance wail that he knew instantly meant his mother was mad at him. He crawled back a few feet from the rimrock and stood up. He deliberately took one last long look into the canyon. The wail of his angry mother started him at a trot back down the trail he had just traveled. As he crossed the inch-high, spongy grama grass toward some buildings, he came suddenly upon a snake. It curved around itself into a tight spiral on the ground, in the middle of his path towards the house. The boy jumped backwards and gasped. The snake raised its head in the center of its spiral and vibrated the rattle on the end of its tail. The boy stared at the snake's head. He stood mesmerized by the bright little eyes and flickering tongue. His mother's yell shocked his mind to the realization that this strange beast was actually scary-looking. He looked all around the snake, then jumped directly over it and ran as fast as his little fat toddler's legs could carry him. "Mama! Mama!" was all I could catch as he ran toward his mother in the distance. She was standing a little ways away from a windmill towards the canyon. She had a narrow, pinched, frightened glare fixed on her face. In her right hand she held out a freshly cut lilac limb. I guess all adventures come with consequences, even for the little brave ones.